I guess if you're going to get people's attention, the best way to do it is surround it with boobs.
What the f is wrong with you people?
You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals. All these things we make no apology are the study of archaeology. But we don't do dinosaurs.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the ArchaeFantasies Podcast, episode 22. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader, and today we're talking about the Legend of the Lighthouse. Ken shares with us a very touching story about how archaeology can be used to reach out to communities and help build ties with local peoples. Get ready for a good story and to think critically.
In a trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day is spent. Funny beady blokes you will see are a staple of archaeology.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah, with my co-host, Ken Fader.
Hi, Sarah, how are you?
And Ken, you are going to talk to us about some research that you have just recently finished up or are still continuing?
Well, it's more or less finished, yeah.
Okay.
The kind of intro for all this, the preface.
Yeah, give us a background here.
And the reason I wanted to talk about this today is that Sarah has just told me that this is episode 22?
22.
So I mean, this one's for the ages, number 22, and
legal. Woo!
There you go. I mean, everybody who listens to this, if you're a longtime listener, or if you're brand new to this, the raison d'etre, the reason for the existence of this podcast. Well, look at the title of it. It's Archaeological Fantasies, right? Archae-Fantasies. So we're looking at sort of extreme claims made in the name of archaeology, extreme claims made about human antiquity, the human past. And how archaeologists, scientists who want to know what really happened, respond to those things. How we respond to claims about ancient astronauts or the lost continent of Atlantis, psychic archaeology, out of place artifacts, and on and on and on and on. And I thought it would be nice today to go at this from a little bit of a different perspective, and that is to look at a real archaeological project. This happens to be one of mine, and it's a real project that has at its core a mystery, right? We begin with a mystery, and when I first heard about this place, the story didn't seem legit. It seemed, well, it must be exaggerated. It's kind of a legend, and let's see if we can apply the archaeological methods, archaeological techniques to discovering how much of that story or legend that's been long told here in northwestern Connecticut, how much of it is legit. And I would have been completely satisfied, and I would not have been surprised at all to find out that the legend, in fact, bears very little relationship to the reality on the ground, the actual archaeology. In fact, though, this is one of those really cool instances in which the legend that's at the core of the story behind the archaeological site we excavated fundamentally is true, that most of the essential qualities, the essential claims made in the legend, we can prove, we can support with archaeological and documentary evidence. So that's the cool. So we're coming at this from a different perspective. Here's, instead of, hey, this is a claim made by non-archaeologists and we're going to debunk it, here's one in which I encountered a legendary story, a mystery, ended up at the site where all this mystery and legend is supposed to have occurred, and then actually was able to test it out on the ground, both archaeologically on the ground and in the town offices across northwestern Connecticut, looking at primary documentary evidence.
So you're in Connecticut,
right?
And Connecticut's, 400 years old?
Connecticut, the oldest settlements in Connecticut date back to 1630. So we're not quite 400 years old. So we go back some ways, right? That's whenever.
Well, Virginia just celebrated their 400th,
Right.
something
All
or
right,
other.
they beat us, but
Right.
it's nicer in Connecticut. It's a funny thing.
It is nicer in Connecticut.
Because the last time we spoke, I mentioned on occasion my 50 sites book, my 50 sites project, where I've been going all over the country visiting archaeological sites that are open to the public, and then I'm highlighting in this book that's going to be coming out probably in a little more than a year from now. So I've done a lot of traveling. And for me, it's a little bit disconcerting, almost jarring, when I go into an old community, say in Utah, and I'm a cemetery freak. I like looking at cemeteries and finding the oldest stones date back to the early 1900s. And in Connecticut, we're looking at this, the middle 1600s. That's old stuff. And towns where the town I'm in was settled in the early 1700s, and you go around the country, and it's in much of the West anyway. The towns, at least the European settlements, are so much later.
Well, it's weird that you mentioned that, and this is very side tangenty, but related to what you just mentioned. When we moved into Virginia, where we are, because this town had been involved in a good chunk of the Civil War, and then also later on had this massive fire, the buildings in this town, even though the area is older than Indiana, where we moved from, the buildings in Indianapolis, Indiana, are actually older than the buildings here.
Mm-hmm.
And Indianapolis will be celebrating, or Indiana will be celebrating their 200th next year.
Right.
So it's really weird being in an area where I know this area is older settlement-wise than anywhere else I've ever lived, but yet I have seen buildings that are older than the buildings here.
Right. Yeah.
Because everything was destroyed.
There you go.
But okay, so you're in Connecticut. You've got yourself this mystery. So what's the mystery?
Well, here's. Let me tell you how I encountered this mystery. It's like
Okay, this is good.
Like 1985, 1986. We're doing a federally funded and state-supported archaeological survey in a place up here, virtually at spitting distance from where I'm sitting right now, a state forest called Peoples State Forest. And Peoples State Forest was established in the 1930s. It was called Peoples because the state literally went to the people of northwestern Connecticut and said, could you sell us some land? We're trying to put together a state forest. By the time they were done, it's about 4,000 acres, which for this part of the world is really pretty big. And it's beautiful, forested, and there's a beaver meadow, and there are streams. It's a gorgeous forest, and hiking and backpacking, and there's camping across the river, and all kinds of fun stuff. So anyway, our job that summer was to do an archaeological reconnaissance survey. The state was interested, and with federal funding, we were able to look over those 4,000 acres. Especially, the state was concerned, well, when they're going to be doing some forestry, will they be disturbing archaeological sites? If they put in roads, if they put in hiking trails, they wanted to be proactive, right? So let's not wait until we want to put a trail in and put a bridge over a stream to find out if there are archaeological resources. Let's do it up front so that we'll have a good base map, which is great.
That's a good idea. I wish more places would do that.
It was really very cool, and there was money was available, and we discovered over the course of the summer, about 10 weeks, I had a dozen field workers. We discovered probably, I think if the number is 30 archaeological sites, which was really nice. And these were sites that we had no idea existed previously, because that's cool. None of this is farmland, nobody's plowing. So that was really cool. Well, it was during one of those transects that we were conducting along the top of a ridge line, where in fact we saw some evidence of historical quarrying, granite quarrying. We followed down this trail down the ridge that was coming down from the ridge, the top of the ridge. And here in Connecticut, the top of the ridge is 900 feet is the elevation. And we're walking down to about 400 feet. So it's not a huge mountain. Jeez. And anyhow, we came down from this ridge onto what looked like a really nice broad terrace, which itself was about 75 feet above the floodplain of the river, which was down below us.
Uh-huh.
The river is the Farmington River. So we're on this terrace and walking around and say, well, this would be a great place where based on our sampling process, our sampling procedure, we're going to put in a transect on that terrace. As we began walking around this terrace, very thickly wooded, we noticed that clearly this terrace had experienced disturbance in the past. And what I mean by that is we were seeing sort of quasi-rectangular depressions, some of which were lined with crude fieldstones. So it was abundantly obvious that these were some kinds of cellar holes or foundations, and we had no idea what was going on. We didn't know why those existed. We put in test pits all around this area and came up with mostly early 19th century artifacts. So these were things that historical archaeologists looking at the kinds of ceramics, the kinds of metal, the kinds of really corroded and rusted out nails, all gave evidence for an occupation of this area, maybe the late 18th century, but certainly the early 19th century. And so we were pretty excited about that. And this is the embarrassing part of the story, Sarah. This is why archaeologists always have to do very detailed background data on the land where they are doing an archaeological survey before they go out in the field. So we dig out these test pits. We're pretty psyched. We're stoked about this. We come down off of the terrace and we see that there's a road, East River Road, which used to be an old stagecoach road, but it's paved. And on the other side of the road, there is this cutout where you can park some cars, and there's a trailhead right there into the forest. And now we're looking right onto the river from this little cutout. So we walk down to the cutout, and everybody's got their backpacks on, everybody's got their lunches, and we break for lunch. And we're archaeologists, so the cliche that all archaeologists do during lunch is tell dirty stories. That's absolutely not true. After we're done telling the dirty stories for the third time, we actually talk about the research that we're doing. And everybody was psyched about this.
Or if it's soda or if it's pop. That's the other conversation. You always have to ask, how do you pronounce, is it soda or is it pop where you're from? Oh, it's Coke.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. But for us, you bring your lunch in a bag. You never bring your lunch in a sack. That would be ridiculous. So there's that argument too, right? But so anyway, so we're sitting there, and we are, in fact, discussing the possible explanations for what is this community. It's not a standard kind of colonial European, the architecture of the foundations, the masonry doesn't look like a standard, colonial foundation. So we're talking about what it could possibly be. Now, in our neck of the woods here in southern New England, there are a number of possibilities. One of the things that we got really psyched about was the possibility that we had encountered a heretofore unrecorded community of freed slaves. There are a number of sites in New England that represent communities that were established by folks who had escaped from slavery in the South, and their original plan was probably to go to Canada. When they found themselves here in Connecticut, surrounded essentially by abolitionists who supported their having escaped from servitude in the South. So in some cases, these folks felt comfortable enough to settle in. Here in the Northeast, not just Connecticut, in the Northeast, for example, in New Jersey, there was a community called Skunk Hollow. And there's a wonderful book about the archaeology of Skunk Hollow, and this was a community of escaped and freed slaves. Parting Ways, which is in Massachusetts near Plymouth, the earliest settlement here in New England. Well, Parting Ways was a community of, in fact, escaped and freed slaves. Black Lucy's Garden is a site up in Massachusetts, which was Black Lucy was the name the woman goes by historically, and she was in fact a woman of African descent who had settled in Massachusetts, and other escaped and freed people of African descent came to her community, her little community in Massachusetts, and established a foothold here in New England of escaped and freed slaves. We thought, oh my God, maybe we've got one of these, because these communities, generally speaking, don't look like the typical European colonial settlements. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, and in fact, in some cases, the material culture, what seems to be reflected in terms of ceremonialism and religion, and even some of the architecture actually looks West African, which is incredibly cool. One of my colleagues, Dr. Warren Perry, has done a bunch of work on this in New York and here in New England, and it's just amazing stuff. Anyway, so
right. No, that's interesting because I'll let you go, but that's interesting to me because with the work that I did doing my undergraduate degree, one of the things that we really tried to push was that you really could not tell the race of a person just from the archaeological evidence that was left behind. But you're saying that you could.
Well, what my buddy...
But this is much later in the past.
Yes, but my friend and colleague Warren Perry, what he says is that what has happened for a long time is that you need African eyes to see Africanisms in the material culture. So that if you, from the perspective of a European or an American trained archaeologist, you're not seeing things that somebody who is necessarily a native African back in that period would recognize as a Minkisi bundle, for example, or a Sankofa symbol. That these things were, and in fact, that it's the really cool thing that Warren Perry and a number of other scholars have determined is that these kinds of symbols, these kinds of things were in fact hidden. They were hidden from greater white society because these guys, these African people were afraid that if they were discovered practicing their own religious beliefs, that they would get in a lot of trouble. And it's a really interesting. This is a time for another argument, and I can even get I can probably get Dr. Perry involved in this as well. But you know what it's like, Sarah. We are blowing smoke out of our ass at this point, right? In the field, what could it be? Is it possible? This is so cool. And while we're doing this, one of my students, one of my field workers, walks down the road. Now this road, it's a road that there's some traffic on, but not very much. And so we can see him, and he's kind of in the middle of the road, and he seems to be staring at a boulder on the side of the road. And, this is, sometimes archaeologists, they get a little sunstroke, and they do weird stuff. And his name is Bill, and Bill called out to me, and he said, "Hey, Kenny, is this important?" And I said, I don't know, Bill. And I'm just kind of blow him off. And he said, "No, Kenny, you ought to come over and see this."
I was like, "No, I'm eating lunch."
But I went over and saw it. And in the boulder on the side of the road where he was staring at this boulder, there's a plaque. And we had come from up above the road, so we had not seen this plaque. And I'm reading the plaque, and the plaque reads, this part of the People's Forest was given to the state of Connecticut by the Connecticut Daughters of the American Revolution, so the DAR, in like 1929. Right. And then under it said, near this spot was the site of an Indian village. Now, you understand, we have just been in an isolated village surrounded by woods. And this village is obviously old, and now we have no idea what it is. We're talking about what it possibly could be, and here's this plaque that says, "All right, there's an Indian village right near here." And so my student said, "Is this important?" And I said, "Bill, I think that might be important." So what I did was the next day I had my crew out in the field, and I went kind of with my tail between my legs, a little sheepishly, into town. I'd been in town before. I'd been talking to folks, and nobody had shared this story with me. And I went to the town library, and I said, "Look, we're doing this archaeology project up in People's Forest, and we saw this plaque about an Indian village, and we actually saw the remnants of it. We think that's what we're talking about. Who can tell me about this Indian village?" And they said, "Oh, you mean the lighthouse." Now, just all you need to know is a tiny bit of geography. Barkhamsted, Connecticut, which is where this was, is about 60 miles from the coast of Long Island Sound.
So no good reason to have a lighthouse.
There's absolutely nothing sensible about a lighthouse being in Barkhamsted. So when they said, "Oh, you mean the lighthouse?" I say, "What lighthouse? What are you talking about? Why would there be a lighthouse in Barkhamsted?" And then the absolutely precious response was, "Oh, it's not actually a lighthouse. That's just what it's called." I said, "Oh, well, what can I find? Can somebody tell me something about it?" They go, "Oh yeah, there's a book." And I said, "Oh my God, how did I miss this doing the research?" So they hand me this thin little self-published book, and it's called "The Legend of Barkhamsted Lighthouse," and it's by this fellow Lewis Mills. Now I recognize that the book was published in 1952. Now I recognize the name because a high school in Burlington, Connecticut, which is also in northwestern Connecticut, is named after him. It's the Lewis C. Mills Memorial High School. And I knew that Mills had been, he was the superintendent of schools, but he also was an amateur historian with some training in history. And he had written a couple of books about Connecticut history that were pretty well received back in the 1950s and 1960s. So Mills was the author of this book. I said, well, great. It's a nice, short little book. Maybe it'll tell me something about this place that we have just discovered. And we'll put we'll put discovered in quotation marks, right? So I bring the book home and I open it up. And Sarah, I'm immediately horrified by what I'm looking at.
Oh?
It's only 150 pages long, but the entire thing is a poem.
Oh.
It's a 150-page long poem. And,
wow.
And the thing,
well, props to him for being able to do that.
I guess. Well, exactly. And it's done in I don't know, what do you call it, a rhyme, a meter. That's exactly like back in the old days, Longfellow's famous poem Hiawatha, that all kids had to learn it. By the shores of Gitche Gumee, by the rolling big sea waters, was the village of Nakoma. Well, what Mills did was he took that.
And Ken still remembers that poem. Well, just wanted to throw out there.
Sarah, I'm old enough to have lived it, So anyway, Mills appropriated that same pattern of speech for his poem. So now it's like, in the town of fair Barkhamsted, by the rolling Tunxus River, was a village partly blended, partly white and partly Indian, partly from the vagabonds and early settlers, and it goes on like that for 150 pages. But here's the deal. Initially, I'm like horrified by this. I go, oh my God, I have to read. I like limericks, dirtier the better, but a poem about a historical site, not so much. But man, I got to tell you, I started reading it and I became absolutely transfixed because it tells this amazing story. All right, here's the story told in this poem that has been passed down in legendary form for like.
Actually, I'm going to stop you before you start reading that poem.
You bet.
Because we're going to take a break.
Absolutely.
And I think that will be the perfect place to pick up for after we get back from the break. So stick around and you get to hear Ken's reading of the epic poem of The Lighthouse.
If you turn off now, you're never going to hear about The Lighthouse.
The CRM Archaeology podcast brings together a panel of cultural resource management professionals to discuss the issues that really matter to the profession. Find out about networking strategies, job hunting, graduate programs, and much more. We'll often feature interviews with college professors, CRM business owners, and experts as well. Check out the show on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/CRM Arc Podcast. Let's get back to the show.
And we're back, and Ken, you have some epic saga-like poetry to read for us.
Well, I'm going to, I think I won't terrify people by reading a poem, but I'll tell the story as told in the poem. All right.
I feel like at some point we need to record you reading this poem, though, so that people can read it. It'll be like a special episode.
What we should do is, and then sell it as something you can listen to in your car on the way to work. Ken Fader reads The Lighthouse story. I'll do all the parts. I'll do Molly and whatever. So, but here's the thing. Check out the story, though, Sarah. So the story starts with there's this wealthy white woman living in the town of Wethersfield, Connecticut, which is one of the oldest towns in Connecticut, along the Connecticut River. So smack dab in the middle of the state. And her name is Molly Barber. And her father is the richest guy in town, Peter Barber. And Molly is, by the standards of her period, which is the middle of the 18th century, Lewis Mills says it's 1740. That date is not something that I can support with any hard data, but middle 18th century sounds about right. She is like in her mid-20s and she's not yet married, which is a little bit out of the ordinary for that period. And in Mills's version, the reason is that none of the suitors who have pursued her have been suitable. They're unsuitable suitors. So her father, the richest guy in town, decides that all these guys that she's, trying to hook up with are not good enough for his daughter. And the funny part here is that, and again, this is written in 1952, and it's about something that's supposed to have happened 200 years earlier.
Right.
In the poem, and there's no way Mills could know that Molly actually said this, Molly actually gives her father an ultimatum about her most recent beau. And what she says, and now I am quoting, "Cross me now." This is Molly talking to her dad. "Cross me now, and I will marry he who next shall seek my hand, be he white or any color." So you get it. Here's a woman, at least according to Mills, in the middle of the 18th century, telling her dad, "You know what? You keep throwing out my boyfriends. You know what? If some guy who's not white asks me to marry him, I'm going to say yes. What do you think about that?" And in the poem, her father totally freaks out, locks her in their mansion, and kind of locks her in her room.
Well, this will work out well.
Yeah, exactly. And won't let her out of the house until she relents and says, "Okay, Dad, I won't marry somebody outside of my race." At the same time, completely coincidentally, a young Narragansett Indian man, his name is James Chogum, is born on Block Island, which is an island in Long Island Sound. He has moved onto the mainland, so he's in Rhode Island, Connecticut, along the shore there, and he begins learning the ways of the white man, learning to speak English, learning getting a feel for the technology of the European colonists, and has actually moved up along the river towns, along the Connecticut River, and has wound up in Wethersfield, the town where Molly's living, at about the time she's given her father her ultimatum. Now, the big estate that Peter Barber, her father owns, he needs people working on the estate, and when this young, healthy Indian man shows up looking for work, he's hired to work on the grounds of the estate.
Of course he is.
Of course, right? Now, what happens next is that apparently James hears about the fact that this wealthy white woman has said she'll marry the next guy who asks because she's mad at her father. And according to, this is the romantic part, all right? The romantic part of the story is that James climbs up the trellis where the roses are growing and bangs on Molly's window. She opens, he gives her a rose, and I don't know, love blooms among the roses. And essentially in the poem, James says to Molly, "So I hear you're going to marry the next guy who asks. Is that true?" And she says, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, okay, I'm asking." And Molly says, "Sure." And that James and Molly disappear in the middle of the night.
Okay.
Now, according to the story,
did he climb up her long golden hair?
No, there's no long golden hair in this version of the story. But you can add that if you'd like. In the kids' book version, we can have her letting her hair down from her room. Anyway, the story is that they actually hightail it out of there and go up the Connecticut River and then up the Farmington River, which is a tributary of the Connecticut, and they find themselves literally in the middle of nowhere in northwestern Connecticut, but they find themselves along the Farmington River. There is, in fact, the village, and historically we know this is true, of a group of Indians whose chief's name, at least historically, has been passed down as Chief Cherry. Now, whether that's some sort of anglicized version of a much longer Indian name, or as some stories say, well, he had a thing for cherry wine, and so they called him Chief Cherry. We don't know. Okay. But according to the story, James and Molly actually show up in this village and ask for sanctuary, and are given sanctuary by this Indian sachem, chief. According to the story, that at this point, Molly has left her very comfortable home, her wealthy lifestyle, and is living with a man who's a virtual stranger and of another race. Certainly was a big deal back then. Right. But she is just absolutely releasing all of her Europeanness and becoming an Indian woman. And they say she gets rid of her clothes. She starts wearing the clothes of the Indian women. She darkens her hair. She darkens her skin. There's a whole bunch of stuff involved in that. And that a month goes by when
she darkens her skin with like makeup, or just she starts to get tan because she's outside.
Hair grease or something. Who knows?
Hair grease. All right.
So anyway, again, this is all according to the poem. About a month goes by, and a bunch of white guys on horseback come into the village, bang on the doors of all the wigwams, say, "Everybody out! We're looking for a young white woman. There's a reward. Her father wants her back." And everybody is terrified. They come out of the wigwams, and Molly among them is out there. According to the story that Mills tells, these guys go down the line and they look everybody right in the eye, look every woman in the eye, and they look at Molly, but they see an American Indian. They see a Native American woman. They don't think she's a white woman. And so they say, all right, well, if there's a reward, if you see a white woman, be sure to contact the people downstream so that we can collect her. They leave. James and Molly, totally freaked out by this. They go, what happens if there are more perceptive pursuers next time? What happens if my father is among them? He's not going to mistake me for somebody else. So James and Molly ask Chief Cherry to provision them, and they move even farther northwest along the Farmington River into the place that today is called Barkhamsted. So this is miles and miles away from anything. There are no European settlements. They assume that they're safe. They stop at this bend in the river. They leave. They find this terrace above the river, and they say, we're not running anymore. This is where we're going to make our stand. And they establish a village of two. And in the poem, Mills even has Molly sort of, agonizing now. Oh my God, what have I done? I've abandoned the comforts of my wealthy household. All of my friends are no longer. I'm in the company of my friends, and I am now in the wilderness in a little lean-to, and it's getting cold. It's the fall, and I am living with a man who really is a stranger to me. And
now all of this supposedly happened in the first year they're together?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the first few months actually.
Okay.
Mills actually has her say, she's weighing her options here, and she decides that she's better off facing mountain lions and wolves and bears in the wilderness of northwestern Connecticut than going back to hear her angry father shouting, is exactly the way Mills phrases it. So her father must have been one hell of a son of a bitch. She's rather, I'm better off here. And according to Mills, not only did James and Molly get through that first winter, not only did they survive, they thrived, and soon thereafter, she started having children. And according to Mills, she has 8 children over the course, she and James had 8 kids over the course of their lives, and talks about this community, this family, into which other people kind of wandering through northwestern Connecticut, they see this little community with its husband and wife and all these kids, mixed race, and other people, Native Americans, landless and disenfranchised white people, people of African descent, start being attracted to this little community because they're accepted. It's the wilderness. Nobody owns the land. You can squat on it. And this community grows as the family grows. And then eventually, because people are moving into the community, the children of James and Molly, they grow up there, they get married, they have kids of their own. And after a time, we've got this community that the outside world is completely unfamiliar with, doesn't know exists. And yet here it is in northwestern Connecticut, this community of people of different ethnicities, different cultures, different backgrounds, different histories, all accumulating on this mountain. I'm reading this in the poems thinking, if any of this is true at all, it's spectacular. What an interesting community that basically has had very little history done on it, but has this legend, has this poem. So I decided at that point, I said, you know what? This looks like, this has fallen into my lap. this mystery or legend of the lighthouse. Why is it called a lighthouse? Who are these people? Is any of the story that Mills tells actually true? And so I devote now this is a few years go by. I'm doing other projects, and in the early 1990s we begin doing serious archaeological research and serious documentary research of this community. And the thing that's incredibly cool is we find out that at least the skeleton of that story, a young white woman living someplace along the Connecticut River, marries a Narragansett Indian man. They disappear into the wilderness. They begin having children. Other people of, again, other ethnicities move into this community. That part of the story, that's all true, and we can support it with documentary evidence, and the archaeological evidence absolutely complements what we see in the documentary record. Just as a little side piece here, why in the hell is a village located in northwestern Connecticut called the Lighthouse? And
Yeah,
we
that's really still weird.
actually have that. Mills figured that one out. The road, I called it East River Road. That's the name of the road. I actually, right now, I live on East River Road, which is kind of cool. So East River Road was at one point the Farmington River Turnpike. So all throughout New England, we have these turnpikes, and the turnpikes, which today are, many of them are paved major thoroughfares, getting from place to place here in New England. But originally they were stagecoach roads. In the stereotype, we think of stagecoach as being, well, that's out west with John Wayne and those guys. We had stagecoaches here in New England as well. The what we call the Albany Turnpike. It was, in fact, a stagecoach road from Albany to Hartford and then ultimately to Boston. And now it's Route 44 in Connecticut. It's a major road, 2 lanes in each direction. The Farmington River Turnpike, which is now East River Road, was a feeder road for the Albany Turnpike. And most of these turnpikes were private enterprises. Everybody loves Toll House cookies. Well, those toll houses are where people who owned these narrow bands of land collected payment so that you could go on that road with your stagecoach. So the Farmington River Turnpike, which is East River Road, which is the road we were on when we first saw the plaque and had just come down off of the terrace overlooking the road, that Farmington River Turnpike becomes a turnpike in like 1790. And so stagecoaches, for the first time now, this isolated community, which already was there, was seeing regular traffic right outside their doors. And the story is that it was the stagecoach drivers who gave the community its name. Because if you're going from, say, Albany to Hartford, basically much of that trip is through an uncharted wilderness. You've got the stagecoach road, but there are very few communities along that road. And no GPS, no odometers.
Right.
What these, according to a number of historical sources, what these stagecoach guys, when they would see the smoke rising from the hearth fires, when they would see the illumination of the fires in the windows of these little cabins along the side of that mountain, they would say, there's our lighthouse. We're 5 miles until port. And port was the town of New Hartford, Connecticut, where there was an inn where on this long trip from Albany to Hartford, you could stop, you could water your horses, you can get a meal, you could get provisions, and then continue on 25 more miles to Hartford. Today, that 25-mile trip on what is now Route 44 will still take you about 45, 50 minutes, even an hour in traffic. So back then, with a stagecoach, that was still a long and arduous journey. And even in Connecticut, it was a long and arduous journey, and there were turnpike robbers. And there's a part of the Farmington River, it's called Satan's Kingdom, and it's a narrow gorge. And in that narrow gorge, we had crooks who in the 1700s and 1800s were hiding in that gorge. And when the stagecoach would cross the river, they would attack it and steal stuff. So we have our own version of, the outlaw gangs that were living here in Connecticut a couple 300 years ago. Anyway, Anyway, so the deal is, so they're the guys who ostensibly were calling it the lighthouse, and that name stuck. When I looked further, I found a couple of things. I found a map that was made in Connecticut in 1879, and that map is a famous map in an atlas of the towns of Connecticut, and that map shows things like graveyards and schools and factories. So it's kind of a general map of cultural map of Connecticut 1879. If you look at and the map is in sections. If you look at the map along the coast, you see an icon used repeatedly and consistently for a lighthouse, and those represent where there were actual lighthouses. When you look at this 1879 map, which is 100 years after the community was settled, maybe a little more,
Right.
there's the lighthouse icon that you see all along the coast, smack dab in the little Barkhamsted, there's a lighthouse icon. So in 1879, when this guy was making this map, somebody told him there's a lighthouse in Barkhamsted. He probably said, "What the hell are you talking about? It's 60 miles from the coast." They said, "Trust me, there's a place called Lighthouse. You need that icon there." So that's pretty cool. But even cooler, and you know what, Sarah? I think I'll send you. I've got a photograph of this, and I'll send it to you. You can post it if you want on the blog. I found now the town in Connecticut. It was the responsibility of town clerks to keep track of births and deaths and marriages. So the state didn't take those records and keep those records back 200 years ago. Our counties in Connecticut are virtually meaningless. So we have, I don't know, 5 or 6 counties in Connecticut, but they don't mean anything. There's no such thing as a county seat. We don't have a county courthouse. It's everything falls to the towns. So the town of Barkhamsted, it was their responsibility to keep track of births and deaths. And so it's great. You go, it's like doing it's like digging in documents where you sit there and you go over these pages of these kind of linen sheets, and 200 years ago, a town clerk drew a bunch of lines and made a little, a spreadsheet and wrote in the names of babies born, the dates of their birth, and on and on and on. So it's in a birth record for 1858, I think it is. I'm going down that list, and I'm seeing the names. One of the columns is whether the name of the baby, and if the baby doesn't have a name yet, when the town clerk is recording it, that's left blank because kid maybe hadn't been baptized yet, hadn't been christened yet, so the kid has no name.
Right.
The sex of the child is listed, whether it's a male or a female. The names of the parents, the ages of the parents.
It's good to have these kind of documents.
Oh, it's amazing. And
yeah.
I mean, if I could go back in time, people say, well, if you went back in time, what would you change? And people say, well, I would go back in time and I would kill Hitler, or I would go back in time and I would buy, IBM stock before it got really big. I would go back in time and give every town clerk in the state of Connecticut a typewriter so that they could type their records. So I wouldn't have to read their horrible handwriting.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's just me. I have a warped priorities. But anyway, as I'm going down this list, I see that there's a baby born, a little girl, no name given, in I think it's March in 1858, and I see the names of the parents, and the names of the parents are Mary Webster and Solomon Webster. The thing is, as I'm doing other documentary research, I determined that Solomon Webster was a Mohegan Indian, so he's a Native American who moved into the community and married I believe, a granddaughter of James and Molly. So Mary, whose name now is Mary Webster, is in fact a granddaughter of James and Molly Chogum. So, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And now here's the deal. So they're born. So the child is born. Remember that Saul is Saul is a Native American. We know that.
Right.
Mary is of mixed race. That is, one of her grandparents is white. One of her grandparents is a Native American, and so she's mixed. She is whatever percentage you want to figure out. So she's got Native American ancestry and Euro-American ancestry. Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
there's a column on this sheet in Barkhamsted for color. The color of the baby. Every child born.
Because these things are important.
Oh, yeah, you've got to keep that. For various reasons, the towns of Connecticut, as elsewhere, are keeping track of the race or color of every child born. The color of every other baby born in Barkhamsted is either W for white, and there's N for Negro. And that's and for the vast majority of the children born in the mid-19th century here in Barkhamsted are W's. Right. I have never seen this designation anywhere else, or seen it before, or seen it since, and it's great. For this little baby, this baby born, her dad is a Native American, her mother is mixed. The color is given not as white, but it clearly says nearly white.
Nearly white?
Nearly white. How's that for a racial designation? I mean, the thing that gets me is that here we are in the 21st century grappling with these issues about race, and how do we define that? And how does somebody define who they are? Because there's so much admixture, and you get the census and you have to say, well, you're white, or you're black, or you're Hispanic, and is Hispanic a race? So we have all these issues about race today. Well, here in 1858, the town clerk of Barkhamsted takes a look at this baby and says, well, I don't know, not an Indian, not white. We'll call the kid nearly white, which is great. But I guess that's a cool story. But the reason for my telling the story is that the final column on this birth record is an indication of where do the parents live. Now, the vast majority of the parents, people giving birth in Barkhamsted, living in Barkhamsted. There's one child who's the place of the parents, where the parents live, is Lenox, Massachusetts, which is up northwest of here. So not every child born in Barkhamsted is born to parents who live in Barkhamsted full time. But for the most part, they are Barkhamsted, Barkhamsted, Barkhamsted. The child born in 1858 to Saul and Mary, whose color is designated as nearly white, the community of the parents of that child is listed as Barkhamsted Lighthouse. So no matter how the name started, there is an official town document designating the part of town where these people live and clearly stating the place is called Barkhamsted Lighthouse. So there's no question at all that was a real designation for this place. So that was really pretty cool. In doing the documentary research, we have been able to verify most of at least the general claims made by Lewis Mills in his poem. Mills did it's a spectacular piece of work to think that here's this guy in the 1950s with you don't have the internet, you don't have genealogy.com, you're basically looking at newspaper accounts and birth records and death records. He came up with a pretty accurate description of what had happened at least once James and Molly established a community in Barkhamsted. It really was a place called the Lighthouse. Oh, and you know what? The births of the original record that says, his poem that says there were 8 children. Not only is that true, I can name every one of those kids. There's Solomon Chagum and Samuel Chagum, and there's Mary. There's a Mary who's called Polly. There's Maribah, and there's Elizabeth, and there's Susan. We also know that of the 8 children, think about that. Think about this pampered white woman living in Wethersfield, Connecticut, abandons her home, living in the wilderness with a virtual stranger, at least initially.
Right.
Has 8 children. Of those 8 children, 7 of them reached adulthood. Now, back in the
that's good,
in the 19th century, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's really good.
You walk around cemeteries here, in my area, and it is pretty common to see about maybe as high as 50%, half of kids dying before the age of 20. So
Right.
either they die in childbirth, they die in their early years, or they die in their teen years. And it's accidents and disease, and for drowning is a real big one. Getting thrown by a horse is another big one. But certainly a lot of tuberculosis kills a lot of folks.
Right.
And seasonal afflictions are they're not always recorded on gravestones or recorded in the death records, but some of these things appear seasonally and very predictable, and without adequate medical attention, people are dying in great numbers. To have 7 out of 8 of your kids reach adulthood is amazing.
Yeah.
And of the 7 who survive to adulthood, 6 of them get married.
Nice.
One child, Elizabeth, actually never marries, but all the others marry. And in many cases, we can actually find the names of their kids and their kids' kids in the in the documentary record, which is just amazing. Now, I haven't talked about archaeology much yet, but we have actually done archaeology at the site.
I was going to say, you have talked about archaeology, because people don't understand that there's a lot of research that goes into this.
Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of times people say, well, how about digging? We did that. But in order to make the digging make some sense, in order to put the digging in context, you need to do the historical documentation. You need to know if we can find out who these people were, which of the houses they lived in. That's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
And also, I will tell you, kind of to get to more towards the end of the story and then go back. The first person who lived at the lighthouse who I encountered was Molly in the documentary record. When I started looking at records that might allow me to examine the veracity of the Lewis Mills poem, I went through the death records of newspapers published in Connecticut in the early 19th century. And now Lewis Mills tells in the story, he says that Molly Chagum, the woman who was named Molly Barber, the name she was born with, Molly Barber, that Molly Chagum died in 1820. And when Lewis Mills did the math, that meant she was 105 years old, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
Folks, I mean, people usually assume that everybody died young back in the early 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. That's not true. The mean age of death is much lower than it is today, but you will still find people who lived into their 80s and 90s and even low hundreds during that period. So it's not out of the question that Molly could have been 105, but I thought that was a gross exaggeration. So the first thing I do is I'm looking at death records around 1820. I find Molly's obituary, and it's not a lengthy description of her life. It's essentially who she was, year she died, how old she was, and where she died. And I found that Mrs. M. Chagum died in Barkhamsted in 1818 while living at her son-in-law William Wilson's house. And now William Wilson, we find out, in fact, was married to one of James and Molly's daughters, so that's perfect. Nice. And
that's good to find that kind of a chain, though.
Oh, it's amazing. And but she was not 105 years old, Sarah. According to the Hartford Courant, she was 104.
Oh, wow.
Now, back in that.
Now, hang on. Before we go any further, we got to take our last break. And if you don't wrap it up, then that's fine. We'll just do another show.
Yeah, you bet. No, we'll wrap it up.
We'll wrap it up. All right. So when we come back, Ken's going to get more into the digging archaeology, or just finish this story, because this is really cool.
All right, there we go. Finish the story.
The Archaeology and Ale podcast presents a monthly series of lectures on all aspects of archaeology. These lectures are part of the Archaeology in the City program, hosted by the University of Sheffield in England, and are held at the Red Deer pub near the end of the month. The podcast can be heard a few days later. Check out the Red Deer if you're in the area, or find this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Okay, and we're back. And Ken, go.
Yeah.
This is good stuff.
So here's the deal, Sarah. So yeah, look, the archaeology is super interesting, and we were essentially what we find at that site is that these were really poor folks who were essentially relying on the cast-offs of the growing Euro-American population in northwestern Connecticut. So, which is really cool. So you don't find like sets of dishes. You find all kinds of different pieces of crockery. And
Right.
once that stagecoach road opens up, then all bets are off because they're able to access all kinds of trade items, and especially as other folks are moving into the area, bringing their material culture with them. It's all really cool. But
Right.
the thing I want to talk about here at the end is how archaeology really can connect on a very important level, intellectually, but also emotionally, with living people.
Yeah.
James and Molly have a bunch of kids. Their kids have a bunch of kids. Their kids have a bunch of kids. Those people are still here. The descendants of
the
James
descendants
and
are
Molly
still there. Yeah.
here. So, this is back in the early 90s, and a local TV station came out and did, the human interest report on the archaeology of the lighthouse. Tell us the lighthouse story. So we do that. The next day, we've broken for lunch. We're down along the road there, where we first were, when we discovered the site. I'm putting "discover" in scare quotes. And a pickup truck rolls into the area, and out of the pickup truck comes this bear of a man, this huge guy, older man, big beer belly, wearing a baseball cap, and a big black dog inside the pickup. And I'm sitting on the ground here. I don't know who this guy is. A lot of people stop by there all the time. They go fishing by the river. But he walks right up to me because clearly he's seen me on the television. And he's Sarah. I'm not a big guy, man. And this guy's huge. And he's older, but he looks like he probably could break me like a twig. And he's glaring down at me. And so I figure I'm going to stand up. And I'm wondering whether my field crew will back me up here. So I stand up, and he's just looking at me with kind of a bemused look. And I said, "Oh, can I help you?" He puts out his hand to me, and he says to me, "Shake my hand." And I said, "Okay, I will." And I shake his hand, and he points up to the hill, and he says, "You've just shaken hands with one of them. I'm a descendant of Jimmy Choggum." I thought,
nice.
Oh my God. And Sarah, here's the part that I think, this is the part that moved me. Me and this guy's name is Ray Ellis, and he's passed away now. Ray Ellis, me, and Rags, the dog, walked up to the site. He had never been to the site. And when I asked him about that, he said, well, around here, being a descendant of those Indians on the hill was kind of a shameful thing. So we hid it from people. We didn't want anybody to know, because the story was, they were just a bunch of drunken Indians, no accounts, worthless. And so this is 1990, even though that's, 150 years after the site was abandoned, 140 years, it was still something to be ashamed about. And so he had never really talked to anybody about it, but honest to God, because a professor at a university was expressing an interest in the community where his ancestors lived, he suddenly felt like he's validated. He can tell people, hey, this is an important story. A professor is looking at it. I don't take any credit for that, but it made me feel really good that my work was having this impact. Sarah, I brought him to the cemetery. There is, in fact, a cemetery with simple field stones that date back to the period of occupation. There's no writing on the stones, but it clearly is a cemetery. And Mr. Ellis, I brought Ray Ellis to the cemetery, and I'm doing my shtick, my archaeology lecture about this all, and I look over to him, Sarah, he's crying.
Aww.
This giant bear of a man, probably at this point in his 70s, was crying, and I realized for the first time that this archaeology I was doing was not just about me satisfying my curiosity about a historical mystery or legend. It was about giving back to people who are the descendants of James and Molly, giving back part of their story, the story as much as I could reveal through my research. Since that time, I have met literally dozens of descendants. And I want to give a shout out to Connie Dubois. Connie Dubois is I think she's 8th or 9th generation descendant of James and Molly. Connie was living at the time, I think, in Indiana. Alrighty?
Oh my.
And her dad told her when she was growing up as a kid in Indiana, we are descendants of an Indian group in Connecticut. And someday when you grow up, I want you to study about it because I don't know very much about it. Connie grows up, now is living near New Orleans. She's living in Louisiana. She's married, got a bunch of kids. And her father, at this point, this is several years ago, is dying. He's on his deathbed. And he said,
Aww.
Connie, I want to know. I want you to help me out here. Tell me who we are. And Connie contacted me. How the hell she figured out that there was some archaeology prof at Connecticut who was studying her ancestors, I still don't know. It was like magic. She contacted me. I gave her all the information I could. She shared it with her dad. Her dad then passed away. Connie has devoted the last, it's got to be 8 years now, to filling out the genealogy of James and Molly. And the best part is that this past summer, Connie came back to Connecticut. And that she's a working woman living in Louisiana. Her husband works on an oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico. She came and set up through a Facebook page a Chagam descendant family reunion. And 60 of these people showed up so that they could see the village where their ancestors lived, so they could visit the cemetery. And we had a big party. I was invited to the party. The town of Barkhamsted, this was July 4th, the town of Barkhamsted invited Connie and all of the descendants to march in the July 4th parade. And this is I never thought this is something that I would look on as something that would almost make me tear up. The descendants invited me to be an honorary member of their family, and I marched at the front of the parade with the descendants of James Chagam and Molly Barber. And I just can't even begin to tell you how moving that was for me. And what was kind of really cool, and if my research has played any role in this, I take no credit for it, but how great is it that the descendants used to be ashamed of being the descendants of James and Molly because, the drunken Indians. When we marched in that parade, the people lining the route, who for the most part are not descendants, but are, people who've moved into town fairly recently, those people yelled out at us, "Welcome home, welcome back" to the descendants of James and Molly. It was it was amazing. It was amazing that a project that begins as, well, this is cool, this is kind of interesting, I'm curious about it, let's do some archaeology, ends up contributing to the story of an otherwise kind of maligned and marginalized group of people. And I am incredibly proud of that. I'm not taking credit, I'm not doing that, but I'm proud of the fact that this research has been able to touch people in that really personal way. And the last thing I'll tell you, and then everybody can cry who's listening to this, Mr. Ellis died a few years ago, and I was in contact with his daughter. And at the end, Mr. Ellis was suffering from dementia, and had his good days and bad days. And he was in an assisted living community. And in 1994, I wrote a book called The Village of Outcasts, which is out of print. But hopefully, I think I'm gonna try to do a CreateSpace version of the book. I have the copyrights to the story now, the book itself, talking about the archaeology and talking about the documentary research. And I'm going to try to get it.
Do that,
I'm going to try to get it back in print. But anyway, it was published in 1994, and I gave a copy to Mr. Ellis. It was my gift to him. And there's actually a photograph, full-page photograph of Mr. Ellis at the cemetery with Rags, with his big black dog. And what his daughter told me was that towards the end of Mr. Ellis's life, when he really was not, he had good days and bad days, the one thing that made him happy was when she would open that book, the book that I had given him about his ancestors, and she would read the story about how he had helped me understand the significance of the research. That's the one thing that would make him smile towards the end of his life.
Aww.
And that's just kind of mind-blowing. As archaeologists, we sometimes are very distant from the people whose lives we are studying. But in this case, no, man, it was immediate and real. And I thank Mr. Ellis, I thank Connie Dubois, and I think all the descendants of James and Molly who have kind of taken me into their hearts and have made me feel like the research I did has had this very, very personal impact on their lives. And that's it just doesn't get any better than that.
No, but that's really cool, though. I mean, this has just been, that's just a really great story and a really great application of, archaeology impacting people's lives, because it's, as small as that family may have started off, they're obviously part of the larger community at this point with that many living descendants. That's a good sized chunk of people.
And what's cool is that Lewis Mills, towards the end of the poem, talks about the lighthouse descendants as an ever widening circle. Like a ripple across a pond. And man, there are lighthouse descendants living in California, living in Canada, living throughout the Midwest. It's a really great story. And within the last few years, the state of Connecticut has a program of designating archaeological preserves. So these are usually sites that are on state land where we say, hey, listen, this place has been excavated archaeologically. This is a really important site, and we're going to, and one of the things that this allows for is the production of a pamphlet. So the state of Connecticut has published a pamphlet that I wrote about the lighthouse. It's 24 pages. It's full color. You can get it from the State Historic Preservation Office, has hundreds of copies. And it tells that, so designating the site as an archaeological preserve provided that money. And then a local environmental group had some extra cash, and they actually funded signage at the site. So today, when you drive down East River Road, there's a big sign right at the trailhead telling the story of, it's just past where that boulder is with the plaque that my student found. Well, just beyond that is this nice sign that tells the story. It's got some photographs. And when you follow the trail, it's in fact a new trail. It's the Lighthouse Trail that brings you through the site. And at 6 places along the trail, there are these small signs, very, very nicely done signs, that tell the story of the cemetery, that tell the story of the foundations, that tell the story of the charcoal furnaces that were they were producing charcoal by the people who live there. It's really nice, and that people walk through there. And the thing, when I'm there and people are walking through, the cool thing is they'll turn to me and say, I had no idea this was here. I say, well, this is the kind of thing that archaeologists need to do a better job of broadcasting the real deal. To get back to what our podcast is all about. This is why it just frosts me, pisses me off that there can be television shows devoted week after week to absolute bullshit about the past. And we have a story like this one, that this is the kind of thing I would like to see highlighted on cable TV. Real archaeology, really interesting stories. In this case, a personally heartwarming story about the contribution that archaeology can make to both our understanding of the past, but also to our contribution archaeology can make to improving the lives of living people. That's the stuff I'd like to see on the History Channel, not the crap that we are exposed to on a weekly basis.
Right. And this story would be, you could make it pretty, someone's already made an epic out of it.
Right.
But you could make this story pretty epic enough to keep someone's attention for at least 4 episodes. Miniseries are great.
There you go. You would think. So if you have any contacts out there, Sarah, with producers, television producers, you let me know. So,
Chris keeps saying that he wants to start a television show about archaeology. Maybe this is the launching point.
Well, listen, you know what? Well, when Chris listens to this, Chris, this is from me to you, man. Well, I'm ready to talk. You talk to my agent. I don't have an agent. I have a cat, though, but that's about as close as I get to having an agent.
And by agent, I mean my cat.
Yeah, there you go.
Ken, that's a great story. I really like it.
And you know what? If people were tuning into the podcast and hoping we could hear another trashing of bad archaeology, and if you're disappointed, I apologize. But it's a really good story, and I think it shows how even a story that starts off as a legend or a mystery, we can, the tools we have as archaeologists are that they render us able to solve those mysteries and to assess the reality, the veracity of those legends.
I think finding true stories is always more interesting than making something up. I mean, fantasy's great and all that, but the true story there, even with a little bit of embellishment with the cool poem, but
Yes.
I mean, it got you started.
Oh, absolutely. It was the thing that inspired the research in the first place, right?
Right. That and the really cool plaque there.
Yeah, there you go.
And a weird name called the
The
Lighthouse.
Lighthouse.
Well, Ken, thanks for sharing that.
Oh,
with
yeah,
us.
absolutely, Sarah. This was great fun, and I hope everybody out there listening to the podcast enjoys it.
I do too. All right, thanks, man. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
No, we don't do dinosaurs.
Thanks for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it and possibly learned something new or useful. If you like what you've heard, please head over to the iTunes or wherever you can and rate and review us. Share us wherever you socialize online and send us an email at archyfantasies@gmail.com with your questions, comment, or just angry emails. You can follow the podcast at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archyfantasies. You can follow us on iTunes, and you can follow the blog at www.archyfantasies.com and get updates at Archyfantasies on Twitter and Tumblr. Also, you can look for us on Facebook. If you're looking for the show notes with links to things we've discussed in this episode, check out the podcast website at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archyfantasies. And thanks again for listening.
No, we don't do dinosaurs. We don't do dinosaurs.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.